Okay, so I just thought I'd take some time to demonstrate that I know where the parts of a motorcycle are, what they do, and also some general problem solving that might occur over the counter with customers' inquiries. So we'll start with the front end of the motorcycle, down with the front wheel. So obviously here you've got the wheel. Now this is a spoked setup. The spokes go into the rim, which is this section here, and that means that this bike runs a tube in there. If the tyre goes flat, it could mean that you've got a nail and the nail goes through and it actually has punctured the tube, in which case you don't have to plug the tyre or anything like that. Usually all that would be required is the replacement of the inside tube. Some problems that can occur with the wheel is the bearings in the wheel. They can wear just like a typical bearing, and it can create a bit of a shudder on the front end or the rear, depending on how bad the bearing is worn. And it's a pretty quick job to fix. You just remove the bearing and replace it, grease it up, and all good to go. This is a disc brake. So you've got your disc rotor, your caliper, and your pads on the inside of the caliper. If your pads are worn, sometimes you'll get a squeal depending on the pads, whether they've got a warning device that they're getting low, or your braking will be quite reduced, that your braking's not going to be as efficient. Very easy to check your pads on a disc. You can actually just look down the side of the disc and you can see the pads and see how much pad there is left, in which case you replace them, and it's a pretty quick and easy job to do. So that's the sort of at the front end here. You've also got your fork tubes and your fork assembly. Now with your fork seals can go. As your shocks compress up and down, a bit of dust or dirt or something, particularly on dirt bikes, can get down into the seal and actually allow it to sort of deteriorate and sort of break apart a little bit, and oil can come out. You'll see oil sort of coming up around here, and sometimes it'll leak quite significantly. Now a lot of people think that this seal here is actually the fork seal. It's not. The seal at the top is the dust seal. If I get a screwdriver and prop that up, the fork seal, the oil seal that holds the oil in the shock, actually sits about a centimetre lower, and it's retained by a clip. If your fork seals go, normally we'd be recommending replacement. There is a tool that you can get called a shock doctor, or a seal mate, and you can twist it around and sometimes get that grime out. It's not got the highest success rate. I've seen it work sometimes, but more or less, typically you're going to be replacing the fork seals if oil is leaking. Just to name a few parts as we go around, this here's your meter. That's got your odometer and speedo, headlight, left-hand blinker. This here is your clutch lever and clutch perch, and that's your left-hand switch block, left-hand mirror. Now the clutch on this bike, you can't start this bike without the clutch being in, and that's what this is here. It's an electrical switch, and that sends a signal to say the clutch is in so that you can start it. So that's a little bit about there. Up on the other handlebar, that's your brake fluid reservoir for the front brake, and your master cylinder at the bottom. And that's what actually sends the fluid down to the caliper, which clamps the pads onto the disc. Just at the front end here as well, we've got the steering bearings inside the steering stem. That's something that can go on a motorcycle. If that goes, typically you'll find that the steering notches, so it's a bit notchy when you're riding it, and it can be a bit dangerous to have. It's not a terribly expensive thing to fix, but some motorcycles it requires a lot of the panels and bits and pieces to be removed, which is a bigger job. Unfortunately, on this motorcycle it wouldn't be that big of a deal. Moving down now to the engine. This is a V-twin setup. So your V and 2 cylinders, V-twin. This is your rocker cover. Inside here are your valves, and they will need adjusting when the manufacturer says it needs adjusting, or when they start to get a bit loud. It's a good idea to adjust them there. It is a bit more of a time-consuming job, valve adjustments, but it's not terribly difficult on this bike because it runs tappets, so as opposed to a shim setup. So it's quite a good setup. This motorcycle has dual spark. You got 2 spark plugs on each cylinder. You've got the rocker cover, the head, which has the valves in it. So, and then you've got your barrel, which houses the actual cylinder or the piston itself. You got your crankcase on this side of the crankcase. You've got your stator, which is basically your alternator, which is the charging system. On the other side, you've got the clutch. The clutch can require maintenance, which is basically if the bike starts to slip when you're accelerating. There's not much acceleration, and it's just not really engaging or disengaging the clutch. You usually look at replacing the clutch fibres. But ideally it's considered good practice on motorcycles. If you're going to replace the clutch fibres, you may as well do the metal plates, and you may as well do the springs as well. Going down here, over here, inside here is your front sprocket for the chain. This is a chain driven motorcycle. Just move out of the way. Your front sprocket can wear. Now if you're going to replace one of the sprockets, you'll normally do both, which there's a rear one just here. You can tell when they're worn. The performance of the motorcycle can be reduced, as well as the teeth on the sprocket tend to get bent. They tend to basically disintegrate. They get rounded, or you can see that the chain has worn bigger grooves in them, which result in you are going to want to replace them, because it can be quite dangerous, because you can snap the chain. That can happen, and if you snap the chain at any higher sort of a speed, it can snap and actually put a hole in the crankcase when it snaps. Front and rear sprockets, that's a gearing option. You can actually change the gearing of the motorcycle by changing the front and rear sprockets so that you can go up or down in the gearing, so you can make it better for off-road use, for example. A lot of people like lower gearing so they can get up hills a lot quicker. But freeway use, like this motorcycle, someone might want to gear it higher so that it's better on the freeway. Usually I stick to standard gearing on all my motorcycles. I find that the engineers that design the bike usually have done a good job as it is. We then go just naming a few other parts as we go around. This here makes up your chassis, your frame, and your rear swing arm down here that holds the rear wheel in place. And also you'll have different things. Down here's your chain guide, which your chain sits on. Rear shock absorber, just there. Obviously, on the other side of this bike is your rear brake. Your rear brake on this motorcycle is a drum system, so it has the shoes that are expanded by a mechanism, and that's what grabs the inside of the drum. Couple of problems that motorcycles can have, I'll talk a little bit about that. The fuel delivery system. Often we have people ordering parts for the carburetors. Now this motorcycle is fuel injected, so it has a throttle body and it has injectors, so it doesn't run into the problems that has a whole other set of problems it can have, but fortunately this one's pretty reliable. But carburetors, a lot of people require the replacement of jets because they're trying to tune it. They'll replace the main jet, put a bigger main jet in it if they've put exhaust pipes on it, for example. The other problem that is very typical is the needle and seat for the float in the bowl at the bottom. That can wear, and that will result in the motorcycle leaking fuel. So if someone's got a leaking fuel, even when the fuel tap's off, it just keeps leaking out of the bowl, typically the needle and seat is stuck, and that's usually about a $60 part. A little bit annoying to replace, but it's not the end of the world, and it's a tiny little thing like that big. So there are a couple of things, a little bit about troubleshooting for motorcycles. If a motorcycle doesn't start for any reason, you're looking at air, fuel, compression and spark. So spark, you check for your spark at the spark plugs there, you can pull the coil out. You can actually leave a spark plug plugged in, make sure the motorcycle's not going to try and turn over, put it up against metal and see if the spark's coming out. If there's no spark, on motorcycles a lot of the time it has to do with the stator not sending a signal. Or it could just be the cap, or the plug itself could be fouled. With air, you're generally looking at the air filter. On dirt bikes in particular, they can get clogged up with a lot of stuff, and reducing the amount of air that goes into the carby or the fuel injection system, and that results in performance drop considerably, or it not starting. So keeping your air filter clean and oiled is good. This motorcycle runs a paper air filter, and again you just check to see how dirty it is and replace it if it needs it. Your fuel issues I've spoken a little bit about with the needle and seat. That can be one thing that stops a motorcycle from starting because it can flood it. And you can either have a motorcycle running rich or lean. Rich, too much fuel; lean, not enough. So you can go back through the lines, check for deterioration in the lines, and also the position of the needle and slide is very important on a motorcycle, particularly if it's had some tuning done. You can make it richer or leaner there to get it running right. Compression, you can generally hear if a motorcycle's got low compression. It's quite easy to tell. It's going to be very hard to start. It can have low compression for a number of reasons. Low compression can be because you've got a riding valve, a valve that's starting to go up through the head, and that will require a replacement of valves. Or it may require piston and rings, which is a top-end rebuild usually you're going to do if you're going to do that. And that is typically, again, dirt bikes or race bikes that have been flogged. Typical road bike like this, it's very rare you'd have to rebuild it. To check whether the bike's got good compression, you usually put a compression tester in through the spark plug, kick her over, see what compression reading you get, and compare it to the manufacturer's specifications to find out whether the compression is up to standard. So yeah, that's a little bit about troubleshooting and bits and pieces on the motorcycle. Yeah, another thing, you've got a cooling system on this bike. That's the radiator here. It's actually quite discreet because it looks like an air-cooled engine, but it does have a radiator. Radiators, a very common thing if someone's actually got an overheating issue, it can be the radiator cap. Several times when a customer's come in, they've put an aftermarket cap on, or somebody has at some point that's previously owned the motorbike, and they don't realise that the caps have a very specific, because of the relief valve, when the relief valve opens over to the overflow tube, and the pressure rating for that. So that's one thing that I'm commonly dealing with. Have to find out what specification the original radiator cap was, if they've got an aftermarket one, and make sure that we get them the right one. So that's a little bit about cooling systems and motorcycles, and a bit about problem solving and the parts on the motorcycle and where they are. Cheers.